All right. Greetings, Bio 17 students. I hope everyone's doing well. This is the second part of the lecture on sociobiology, and this particular portion is on human behavior. And typically we do this as the last unit, but sometimes we move things around based on pandemics and things of that sort, I guess. So let me remind you from last time we were talking about this guy, E.O. Wilson, who wrote a book largely dealing with ants and the evolution of social behavior in ants and other animals. But in the last chapter of E.O. Wilson's book, he mentions how some of these ideas we've discussed throughout the semester can be related to humans. So that's what we're going to do in our final lecture here, at least depending on when you have this class, at least my final portion of this lecture on sociobiology. So first of all, let's take kind of two very different places. This is Skid Row here, and down here we have Beverly Hills. So we have two places that are really not all that far apart distance-wise, but we have one of the wealthiest areas in the United States and one of the poorest areas in the United States being right next to each other. And the question then is, what kind of things lead to poverty and wealth? And is any of that genetic? Is there a culture based on any of that we can predetermine? And in general, the idea of E.O. Wilson's book is that that some of it is somewhat predicted by our genes and the essences of things we've talked about in animal behavior. And people don't really like that. People like the idea of free will, that you can become whatever you want. And E.O. Wilson is suggesting that certain things are not exactly that way, that there's a genetic component. And that's what we're going to explore in this last part. So things like cooperating and humans getting along and crime and attractiveness and success. Is there any measure of those things that we can see in some of the other things we've looked at in other animals? Do we see the same sorts of things in humans? Is any of that predictable based on stuff we've already seen? So first we'll talk about some primitive groups of people that live really much, very much on the land. I mean, obviously they live on land, but what I mean is they interact with the environment in a very cooperative way. So things that you might see in nature strongly affect these groups of people because they can't rely heavily on technology and things of that sort. They're very much interacting with the environment like you would expect in some of the animal groups we've talked about. So first I'll talk about this primitive group called the Yanomamo that are found in parts of Venezuela and Brazil. And there's about 12,000 of them, and they live in these villages of about 40 to 50 people. And they are small gardeners and hunters. So they're a hunter-gatherer society of people. They hunt for their food, they grow food, and they get in fights, with other Yanomamo and have wars like you would expect other societies to have. But since they lack the sort of modern technology of sophisticated weapons, they don't really blow each other up and kill everybody all at once, but they do have these fights and these wars, and many of them involve females and marriages. So what happens is you might have one village, say here, and another village here, and what happens is a woman from, say, this village might marry somebody in this village, and then when there's some buildup of tension and they have a fight, the person that married this woman here, that's our woman symbol. Anyway, the brother over here might get all mad at what this guy did, and then they have a fight, and it turns out 40% of the males have killed someone, and 25% will die in some kind of violence. To put that into to perspective, if you think about our class, certainly in our class, 40% of the people have not killed somebody. That's kind of mind-blowing when I think about it, at least. And 25% die in violence. That doesn't happen to us very often. Violence, it's a rare thing in modern society. But if you live like the Yanomama do, these kinds of frictions are major problems. And what they find out is when they look at how one group of Yanomama might help each other, it's based on the coefficient of relatedness, kind of like what we talked about before. So it turns out they're more likely to help those they're related. So part of the reason that these wars occur is that this female here is brother or sister or daughter to a male over here. And when they get married to another villager over here in a different village, they're not related. So there's this conflict. And these people defend this female, you could say. Okay, so it turns out they're more likely to help those they're related to. And so depending on how close the villages are and the people are, you get different levels of reciprocity, kind of like what we talked about before. So if they live in the same village, they get what they call generalized reciprocity, where they'll tend to help each other out. Without the expectation of return of a particular gift or anything like that. But if it's outside of the village, like let's say it's 2 villages over, or a village over, so they're near each other like this, so they're not in the same village, they tend to engage in balanced reciprocity, where they'll try to help each other out. But the idea is that there's a strict expectation that whatever they give, certain kind of food, they expect sort of the same thing in return. Now, if that village is really far away and maybe they only interact every now and then, so they don't see them all that much, then they engage in negative reciprocity, which is where they kind of like, it's like a swap meet, and they're trying to rip each other off. Everyone's trying to get the better deal out of each other. So, a couple other studies on human behavior. Does it explain sociobiology? Can it help explain mate choice? So in this particular study here, what they measured was salivary estradiol. And what this is it's a measurement of how much estrogen a female might be producing or might have. And what they found was that in general, women that had this body shape, narrow waist, large breast, had higher levels of estradiol, and these categories, narrow waist, small breast, broad waist, large breast, broad waist, small breast, had lower levels of estradiol. And so the idea is, if this is the more attractive body style to humans, and you can decide that on your own, the idea is that's a measurement, or that goes along with a measurement of estrogen, and higher levels of estrogen mean higher levels of fertility. So the idea is that maybe if this is the more sought after body type, that is correlated then with a measure of fertility. Here's another study where they looked at want ads, where one group of people is looking for another group of people, and they looked at the Arizona Solo and the Times of New Delhi in India. So the reason the Arizona Solo, the author of this particular textbook, is at the University of Arizona. So they compare these two very different kinds of cultures. Arizona in the United States and in New Delhi, India, you could expect culture-wise there'd be very big differences in culture and maybe what people are expecting. However, when they look at the want ads from these two places, what they find is there's a very similar pattern, even though the cultures are very different, of what the men and the women are seeking. So in general, the males, which is right here, What are the males seeking? Males are looking for a female that is younger than them. Younger females, although this isn't, mentally, I don't think, thought out to be this way, but younger females have higher fertility rates. So not that men are seeking higher fertility rates, but what I'm saying is what men are finding attractive is correlated with higher fertility rates, whether they know that or not, or like that or not. What about females? Do females want a younger male? Well, it turns out male fertility is about the same, whether they're young or older. But what matters more, probably, is that an older male has more financial and other resources of whatever sort that might be, property or whatever it is. And so females, it turns out, are looking for an older male in both cases, whether it's in Arizona or whether it's in India. All right. What about these drawings of female body types? Which one is the most attractive? Well, in the United States, these categories here are generally thought to be picked more by Americans, let's say in the United States. But these kinds of choices are not universal. So for example, the Yamibato, which is a group of primitive people that more primitive people than modern American society, at least, they live in Peru, and they prefer more along this category here. And so what they found out was that the Yamibato, actually it's this one right there. That's the one I meant to pick. So Americans are picking this group here, and the Yamibato are going for that. And why would they do that, you might ask? Like, why 09 or even 07? What is it they're going for there? Which is very different than what you find in the United States. And so when they ask the Yamibato, okay, why is that? In the United States, people would go for this. They go, oh, no, that's not good. And their reason is they state that these people look more like they're suffering from diarrheal diseases, which is probably not something you're thinking about. But in primitive parts of the world, such as in Peru, access to clean water is a big deal. People get diarrheal diseases all the time, very, very commonly. And so when you have 09 here with this higher waist to hip ratio, it's a sign that they're less likely to have a diarrheal disease, which I find interesting. Which of these is the most attractive male? This is the same person with different genetic modifications on a computer screen where they change the amount of testosterone in the male. And what they do is they look at the female's choice, and what it turns out is that what is considered attractive here, right about there, is not necessarily exactly the same as most dominant. So there's some point where more dominance is useful, which is associated with higher testosterone. But if you go too high, the more dominant, there's a risk factor. Males with higher levels of testosterone take more risk. This has been shown in all kinds of studies across the animal kingdom. It affects insurance rates and everything. But as a general rule, high levels of testosterone don't work out so well in humans or other animals. Okay, what about your mean market value? So they did a study looking at the number of potential mating opportunities. In this case, it's done on males that they have. And you'll see younger males down here, which is the opposite kind of thing you find in females. The mating opportunities of younger males tends to be low in males because of their lack of access to resources. When you're in your 30s and 40s, you tend to be, your market value tends to be higher, and then it drops off again as you get older. Again, this study is done on males, and this study wasn't done on females, so we only have data on males. This study is done on both males and females, and what they asked in this particular study was the number of different sex partners that they, in the United States, basically, of what each sex expected to have or wanted to have. So, for example, you can see very clearly here, there's two very clearly different strategies here. So once again, the question is, can some of the things that we've talked about in the course, do these apply to humans, males and females, in our current society? So, and that decision is kind of up to you to decide. I'm just going to show you the data and you can think about it. So in this case, in the next, let's say 6 months, if you ask females how many different sex partners they want to have over the next 6 months or 1 month, okay, you notice it stays, I don't know, right around 1. Let's call that 1, and let's call that 2, 3, 4, something like that, right? Okay, so what about in the next year? What about the next year? I don't know, maybe the average is, I don't know, maybe 1.8, I'm guessing, something like that. What about over the next 30 years? You notice that females, that's clearly below 5, right? Over the next 30 years, women in general, if you ask them how many sex partners they expect to have or would like to have over the next 30 years, even in their lifetime, you see the average of what they want to have, not what they had necessarily, but what they expect to have over time is around 6. But you ask the males in the next 6 months, it's like 3.5. In fact, in the next year, if you ask, right, the males are already over after 1 year what females are expecting over their lifetime, which has a lot to do with what we call female choice. Males have a very different kind of category by which they're picking and how careful they are at picking mates. Females also have a very different level of picking mates. As a general rule, we find across the animal kingdom, including in humans in many cases, in probably most cases, females tend to be what we call the choosier sex. You're going to hear that a lot. It's not always true. There are cases in the animal world where it's reversed, and we'll talk about that. Or we have talked about that. But anyway, in this particular case, you can see, again, this is what they expect over time, how many different sex partners they have. This is one of my favorite graphs of all time. This is the comparative minimum acceptable intelligence that men and women expect to have under different kinds of dating relationship categories. So, for example, if you're going to date, males and females have pretty much the same idea that if they're going to date somebody, that the acceptable minimum intelligence is somewhere around theirs. They have a similar idea on what the percentile should be relative to theirs. If they're going to date somebody, should be about the same. Okay? Kind of makes sense. Okay? But in a relationship that's going to be based on casual sex, females, you notice, their expectation of what they're willing to accept, it goes up. They expect that the person's intelligence is going to go up. Males, it just drops off to just falls off the chart, basically. Basically, there's not a necessarily a lower level of intelligence relative to theirs. And then when you go back to steady dating and a married partner, they see eye to eye kind of again. In fact, males, maybe you could argue, have a higher expectation than the females in that case. But the real big difference is right here in the casual dating scenario, where men and women see a very different kind of strategy, as you can see there. If you're trying to find out if you're going to try to go to college and you're trying to get money from mom or dad, and you want to go to college, if you're a genetic child of theirs, we've talked about this already, coefficient of relatedness, and how you're related to them in sibling rivalry and that sort of thing. Genetic child, current mate, your odds of getting money for college, quite high. Okay. Genetic child, previous mate. Okay. Somewhere right around here. Okay. Genetic child, but your parents got divorced, but it's your kid still genetically, odds are still pretty high. Okay. Stepchild, current mate, you're married to somebody and they have a kid already. Not your kid genetically, but you're still married to the person. Odds are lower. Okay. What about stepchild, previous mate? Okay. Wasn't your kid genetically, you're no longer married to or with the partner, it drops off. Again, coefficient of relatedness. Now, this one's a little bit, most of these are a little bit touchy. This one's quite touchy. So I want to make 2 points on this here. So this is a study based on child abuse cases in people that were related and were non-related. Okay, so 2 points first to start. No matter whether the graph is high or low, this is a terrible thing. Okay, so that's step number one. It's very important that I point out that this is not good in any way, whether the number is higher than a number or lower than a number. Not a good scenario, a terrible thing. Okay. Second part is what they're trying to show you in this graph is that the number of child abuse cases with two natural parents tends to be extremely low, below 1 per 1,000, so less than 0.1%. Okay. Again, even in a small number, it's still bad. I'm not saying this is good. I'm saying this is still bad. Okay. Now, if you have a step parent involved, it turns out that if that stepchild is young, 0 to 4, that rate tends to be far higher than what you see in two natural parents. However, I should point out, okay, that the number is 13 roughly per 1,000. So what that means, again, it's still terrible and it's not good. 13 per 1,000 is still unacceptable, but it's still a fairly low number. And the reason I say that is I don't want people thinking, oh my gosh, if I have a boyfriend or girlfriend and I have a kid, because if you look at this graph, it looks like it's all the way to the chart, top of the chart. And so sometimes people could get the idea that if you have a step parent, that 100% of your kids are going to be abused. That's not what it means. It means that the number is 13 per 1,000. So that number is still low percentage wise, although it's still unacceptable because it's such a terrible thing. As the kid gets older, and there's different models of this or different ideas behind why this might be. As a kid gets older, the kid might be more likely to be able to tell or call the police or defend themselves. You know, a 16-year-old kid might beat up a step parent and that kind of thing. And the idea also, and this relates to other groups of animals, that these younger kids require more work on the parents' behalf. And so maybe there's some conflict between there. Okay, so there's that. The next thing is there's a couple interesting studies done on why perhaps we evolved things like alcoholism or eating dirt, which we'll talk about, or the use of spices. So first of all, it turns out genetically we might have a predisposition to becoming alcoholics because we are driven evolutionarily to eat ripe fruit. Ripe fruit had more calories in it. It has slightly more alcohol in it. And since there's more calories in it, we might have a genetic predisposition to craving that fruit, which evolutionarily had very few, it had a lot of calories in it, but it had very little alcohol. You couldn't get drunk, by eating a bunch of fruit per se, but we might have a genetic predisposition to seeking that out, which leads us to the dangers of creating alcohol where we take all the benefits of the fruit out and just consume the alcohol. There are certain cultures, both in humans and in other animals, where they eat dirt, and dirt is thought to, it doesn't have any nutrients in it per se, but maybe it has, and they found high levels of tannins and alkaloids, and they think these tannins and alkaloids might detoxify chemicals that are in your regular food. So some cultures that have a practice of eating dirt, which seems odd in many ways, it might be useful in terms of detoxifying other things you might eat. Another one is the use of spices. I think this is a particularly interesting study where what they did was they looked at the proportion of recipes in different cultures of food, and they compared it to the mean annual temperature. And so what they found was there are certain spices such as garlic, onion, allspice, and oregano, which tend to have a pretty high level of bacterial inhibition. So they don't necessarily kill the bacteria, but they do a pretty good job of preventing it from growing. And what they found is in places with warmer climates, you're going to get more bacterial growth. And what they found is places that had warmer mean annual temperatures used more of these kinds of spices. So perhaps things like spicy food evolved in our different cultures and sort of influenced each other because of our need to prevent bacterial growth. And in places where the mean temperature was much lower, these kinds of spices were used, which don't have very strong antimicrobial products. And so this graph shows you kind of a scatter plot, but kind of a line showing you that in places with colder temperatures, they tend to use less of those spices that prevent bacterial growth. And in areas with warmer temperatures, because you'd have more bacterial growth, you tend to see more of those spices used that are over here. Okay. All right. So that concludes then. Well, we have one more thing there, I guess. So in summary, what I want to point out is that are we destined to be poor or successful based on our genes? And the answer really is no. The idea is that if we look at certain large features in animal behavior, large studies, we can see that some of the things that we saw in animals turns out in large population sizes to work out to similar kinds of behaviors we see in groups of humans. As humans, though, we have the ability to be aware of this kind of data, which can allow us to make better decisions and not put ourselves in certain positions where we are victims to or related to certain circumstances. So I think it's a very useful set of knowledge, but it doesn't imply that genetically you're going to end up one way or another. There's still a great deal of interaction with the environment that can happen that can influence those outcomes, particularly with arming yourself with a good set of knowledge. Okay? So I hope everyone's having a good day, and I will talk with you soon.